collaboration with the Cyprus Mail. This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
Coming up this week, we'll hear about sovereignty, contests and conflicts.
The settlements are seen as the creation of facts on the ground which will advantage Israel's position in any final negotiation.
Meet Cyprus European Citizens of the Year.
Instead of having an atmosphere of conflict, we should have an atmosphere of cooperation and peace.
Get the lowdown on access to healthcare in the UK.
If he is a state pensioner, then he's entitled to full range of NHS care, so he can return to the UK. Obviously, he might have to contact his GP or an NHS trust beforehand, but he's entitled to go back and he's entitled to get that care for free.
Find out how fair is our orange juice.
But the problem is many companies are not respecting the law, are not in complying with the law. In Brazil, there are many workers that don't have labor papers, permanent contracts.
And discuss the impact of ISIS on the Middle East.
We have great powers, as you mentioned, not be willing to proceed to any sort of decisive hits on the main source of money for ISIS.
At a recent conference on the everyday lives of sovereignty, contests and conflicts in a transnational era, I had the chance to speak to one of the keynote speakers, Adam Ramadan from Birmingham University. I asked him what the thrust of his talk was about.
Talking about the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, particularly from the point of view of Lebanon's sovereignty or perceived lack of it. There's a conventional view of Lebanon as a weak state that is lacking in conventional sovereignty and requires its sovereignty to be strengthened in various ways. What I talk about in the paper is how sovereignty in Lebanon throughout its post-colonial history has been characterized by hybridity, hybrid forms between state actors and non-state actors. And this draws on the work of Sara Friganese, who's a colleague of mine and co-author of the paper. So the paper looks at the refugee camps and some of the changing power practices and changing sovereignty arrangements around the camps from the late 1960s onwards in particular, and thinks about how they fit into this broader picture of hybridity in Lebanon.
When you say hybridity, what exactly do you mean? Because you're talking at the moment in terms of the refugee camps or the Palestinian camps, and of course they've grown exponentially since the Syrian crisis.
That's right. Hybridity means a mixing of categories that are seen as categorically different. So in terms of conventional views of sovereignty, the domain of the state as a legitimate sovereign actor and the domain of the non-state as illegitimate, as lacking the recognition to act in sovereign ways, those two are seen as ontologically different categories. What we look at by thinking about hybridity is the way that de facto sovereignty has proceeded and been formed through various forms of collaboration between state and non-state, and various hybrid creations, hybrid actors that are in part state, in part non-state, in certain ways state, in certain ways non-state. And we've seen that throughout Lebanon's history since independence.
And of course their long association with Palestinians. How do you view the Palestinians in the Lebanon and in the other areas of the Middle East? They are stateless, aren't they? They don't, even when they land on Europe's shores, nobody seems to be very sure how to treat them and what to do with them because they don't have papers, for example.
Well, Palestine and Palestinians are caught in between statehood and entirely without, lack of statehood. The state of Palestine is self-proclaimed. It is recognised by more states around the world than do not recognise the state of Palestine. But it's been part of the Palestinian story since 1948, and even before that struggle for national self-determination, which has taken various forms in various ways at various times in different places. That being in between statehood and non-statehood has characterised the Palestinian condition forever, really.
And is there any way out of that?
Yes, but the political will on the part of the leadership of Palestine, the leadership of Israel, the leadership of the rest of the world, the United States as a supposedly neutral arbiter between the two sides. The political will is not necessarily there, or not necessarily from all sides at the same time, perhaps. Certainly the Obama administration with John Kerry has put significant diplomatic effort into renewing negotiations, but those negotiations really have been dead in the water since the early 2000s, and the situation at the moment doesn't look terribly hopeful. I think Israel, from the time of the Second Palestinian Intifada, has shifted really from a position where they were willing to contemplate negotiated peace towards a more unilateral strategy of separation through physical barriers like the separation barrier, through the withdrawal from Gaza in 2005. But we don't see from now, I don't think, an easy route towards a two-state solution, which, from an international point of view, is the accepted political solution to the conflict in Israel-Palestine.
So where does that leave the Palestinians? Because on a daily basis we see expansion of the settlements, and it seems more and more land is being removed from Palestinian control one way or another, totally illegally in most cases, with everybody standing by and watching. I'm never quite sure what to make of that.
I'm not sure I am either. Yes, you're right. The occupation has become more and more entrenched throughout the last 2 decades, throughout the period when Israelis and Palestinians were negotiating. Settlements were being expanded at a vastly increased rate from even before the peace process had begun. The settlements are seen as the creation of facts on the ground which will advantage Israel's position in any final negotiation. But they certainly have reached a point where they preclude the possibility of even getting back face to face. And certainly the sort of strategic location of settlements around East Jerusalem to prevent the future redivision of the city, the spread of settlements throughout the West Bank that make any sort of Palestinian contiguous territory very difficult to envisage. These are deeply problematic facts that nevertheless any future resolution of the conflict will have to come to terms with in one way or another. That is assuming that a two-state solution along the lines of two peoples in two states is the only possible outcome for that conflict. And that's the only politically imaginable one at the moment, but certainly the settlements make the reality of a single state with two peoples more likely, not less likely. And what that does for the idea of Israel as a state for the Jewish people, in which the Jewish people may not be a demographic majority for much longer, that's a challenge that Israel as well as Palestinians will have to wrestle with for many years to come.
Keep up to date with events in Cyprus and around the world with the Cyprus News Digest.
At a ceremony at EU House in Nicosia recently, the joint heads of the Technical Committee on Cultural Heritage, Dagis Hagidimitriou and Ali Tunçay, received the European Citizens of the Year Award for Cyprus for 2015. You've both been at the forefront of renovating and preserving the cultural heritage of all Cypriots. How do you feel about having this award, Ali?
Actually, it's an honor and privilege. And I would also actually, with this occasion, I would like to thank all our friends, actually, who help us for saving the common heritage of the Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots and everybody, and the humanity as well. We are not just restoring the buildings, we are also helping the Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots to build the bridges that were destroyed in history, let's say.
Dagis, what about you? It's recognition of the work that both of you and indeed the rest of the committee have done, and I know that it's very dear to your heart. How do you feel?
Yes. First, of course, we represent the committee. It's an honor which is mirrored toward the members of the committee. But at the same time, it's an indication that cooperation is possible. Things are possible to happen in Cyprus. positive message can be given. And we hope that with this award, our work will be facilitated. Next week we shall be in Brussels. And I think what you have not achieved in the past by confronting each other, we can achieve it now for more support with the cooperation of both of us.
And you were talking about the pains of the past in your speeches, but both of you were also aware, I think, of the responsibility that this award puts upon you for forging a common future.
Yes, of course, of course. I mean, we have now a more important responsibility to reach to that aim, actually. Instead of having an atmosphere of conflict, we should have an atmosphere of cooperation and peace.
Yes, what you mentioned actually, up to now, each side knows its own pain. With meeting each other and hearing the stories of the other people, we recognize that pain is everywhere, and we recognize the pain of Cyprus. So what we can do is to put common targets for a common future, to make the life of our children happier and peaceful.
It's a great message for the future, gentlemen. Congratulations once again, the European Citizens of the Year for Cyprus, Tagis Hadji Dimitriou and Ali Tunçay.
In collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
The biggest achievement of Crime Stoppers has been the ability of the public to be able to give information about crime anonymously.
There's no way I could have kept prostituting without the drugs. There's no way I could have had my body used like a public toilet, because that's actually what prostitution is.
And then the fourth series I started 3 days after I'd won the Oscar, so the whole of the Monarch of the Glen experience was all interplatted with the Gosford Park Oscar experience.
I was working with Ronnie James Dio, and David was going to reform Whitesnake in 2003.
Cyprus was chosen because Cyprus is a stable, peaceful and secure place.
We have to really look closely. What are we doing with children? What are we doing with adolescents? And what are we doing with adults that can help them move into a more literate situation?
The ones that I'm proudest of are the ones that were true discoveries, where we found something we didn't know existed.
The British High Commission here in Cyprus brought over an overseas healthcare team who've been giving workshops this week across the island. On Tuesday they were in Larnaca, and yesterday they were in Paphos and then at Pissouri. Martin Standing is an advisor for the Department of Health who was one of the keynote speakers at these events. He joins us now. Martin, what actually, when we talk about access to healthcare in the UK, are you talking about? Because it's something that's of great concern to British expatriates, I think, particularly in places like Cyprus.
Well, the talks actually covered access to healthcare in general, both in the UK and in Cyprus. The problem that we've encountered with a lot of our customers, both here and in the UK, is a lack of getting clear information about how to make sure that they're correctly registered for healthcare. That's the first thing. It's about finding out where to go to get their info, because there are so many rumours around on people's rights and entitlements. You know, people will get their info from their friends down the pub, or they'll go to the town hall, which is nothing to do with the health authority, for example, or they'll hear through a paper. Maybe you get a badly written article or a website. So it's about making sure that we point people in the right direction. That's why people get confused. Is they go to different places, and we needed to tell them, this is where you get your info.
And where do you get your info?
Well, we've got a number of official websites that give information on healthcare. Gov.uk is one of the first ones, and the NHS Choices website is also another one. They've got information on accessing healthcare in Cyprus, and they've also got information on people who want to return to the UK and access healthcare there, either as a visitor or for somebody who's going back to live.
So, I mean, let's take an example, if we may.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Bloggs is living, let's say, in Paphos, and he's been diagnosed with a serious illness here in Cyprus. He's receiving some care here, but perhaps he's beginning to think about whether or not it might be better to return to the UK. Is he eligible to go back to the UK and receive treatment there?
Absolutely. If he's returning to the UK to live permanently, he's eligible for day one. From day one, I should say, sorry.
But if he's still living here and is going back just to have a look and see?
Well, it depends on his situation, okay? If he is a state pensioner, then he's entitled to full range of NHS care. So he can return to the UK. Obviously, he might have to contact his GP or an NHS trust beforehand, but he's entitled to go back and he's entitled to get that care for free.
Even if he's still living in Cyprus?
Even if he's still living in Cyprus. If he's an early retiree, he may not be directly entitled to NHS healthcare. He may have to travel with a European health insurance card from the Cypriot authorities if he was going back to visit the UK. If he wanted to go back to specifically receive treatment, he would need to get pre-authorization from the Cypriot authorities before he goes. Okay, so a little bit more complicated for the early retirees. But pensioners, who are our biggest group, they would be entitled to full range of NHS access if they're registered with an S1 form.
It seems that people therefore are not aware of that fact.
It's actually a recent change for pensioners to be able to go back to the UK. It only came in April of this year. It was a policy that was introduced by the last coalition government and is now in force.
So the main concerns then when you do these talks, because you don't just do them in Cyprus, you work I think in Spain,
Yes.
What are the main concerns that people bring up?
We get a huge range of queries. You know, we've seen it all. We've been set up in Spain for 8 years now, and I think I've heard every single healthcare story it's possible to hear. Occasionally you get a good surprise, but generally, you know, I think we're well aware of those different queries, and they generally, how can I put this? The core of people's problems generally tends to revolve around communication, in terms of getting the right information from people across the desk when they go into health centres and try to register. Or communication in terms of they don't get the right information from the right source.
Do you find situations where somebody goes back, if they've sold up in the UK in order to buy their overseas retirement home, they've probably no longer registered with a doctor. How easy is it to go to wherever they're staying and sign on to the local health centre? Because I presume that's the first step.
Yeah, obviously if they're pensioners, hopefully, if they were going back to receive treatment, they should prearrange that. But if they should be able to just walk into a GP surgery with proof of their identity, proof of their pension and their address, and they should be able to access healthcare. And if they've got a European health insurance card from the country where they live in, they should be able to present that in the GP or in the A&E of a hospital or in a walk-in centre and get healthcare that way. If they have any problems, they can call the Overseas Healthcare Team in Newcastle. The number is on our website, and we gave that out at the event, and they should be able to liaise with the NHS Trust.
So it's presumably brought a lot of relief to a lot of people who weren't absolutely sure what they were entitled to. The Overseas Healthcare Team in Cyprus this last week with the British High Commission.
You can subscribe to the Cyprus News Digest on iTunes for free and get the program downloaded to your phone or tablet so you can listen anytime, anywhere.
Last week, Cyprus joined a pan-European campaign for fair orange juice, and travelling to talk to people in Cyprus about it from an NGO in Brazil was Marcel Gomez. Marcel, you work for an NGO that does many things in Brazil, but you've been very much concerned, I think, with the orange juice issue. What exactly is the problem?
Well, Brazil is the more important producer and exporter of orange juice in the world. But if you analyze what happens in the field in terms of working conditions, we will find that they are very poor. The orange juice plantations in Brazil are concentrated in the state of São Paulo. The state of São Paulo is the richest state of Brazil. But if you analyze the profile, the social and economic conditions of the workers, especially workers involved with the harvest of the oranges, so that we have a problem with this.
Does Brazil not have laws and regulations that govern working conditions for people?
Yes, we have a strong labor law. It's recognized by the ILO, for example, the International Labour Organization, as a model for other countries. But the problem is many companies are not respecting the law, or not in complying with the law. In Brazil, there are many workers that don't have labor papers, permanent contracts. Many workers that are harvesting oranges more than 44 hours a week. The maximum in Brazil you can work is 44 hours a week, but there are workers in the orange fields harvesting for more than 50 hours. So this is a big problem in terms of the health of those workers.
And what about safety of the workers? I read somewhere that they lean ladders up on the trees, and there is very little safety in terms of the jobs they're asked to do. Is that true?
I think in terms of safety, the most important problem is related to the use of pesticides. Brazil is also the number one in the use of pesticides. We use a lot of, including in the orange plantations. There are many problems in terms of the quality of the orange. For example, there is a sick called greening, that is a problem in the citrus plantations in Brazil and also in US. Because of this, the farmers use a lot of pesticides, and if the workers are not protected to use this kind of products, they can be endangered.
And what about the product itself? If such high pesticide use is prevalent, then what about the quality of the orange juice at the end of the day?
Well, I think if you think in terms of the orange juice that is exported to other countries, I think there are more controls about the quality of the orange and the orange juice. But you need to think that there are many Brazilians that are consuming this kind of orange juice, and if this product is sold inside the country, of course the controls are weaker.
I think 2 years ago the average European drank 11 litres of orange juice a year, and 80% of that was imported from Brazil. So this is a huge problem, not just for consumers, but you're mostly concerned with the working conditions. And for years we've had fair trade stamped on so many things. How has orange production and orange juice production in Brazil escaped?
Well, the problem is that the companies are very concentrated. They are very powerful companies. There is a cartel. There are 3 companies in Brazil that control almost all the market abroad. So they are responsible by all the exports from Brazil. Just 3 companies. So they are very powerful companies. It's very complicated for organizations of consumers, organizations of workers, deal and bargain with these organizations, with these companies.
So it's a very powerful cartel, obviously. What do you hope that this actual squeeze out the truth behind the orange juice business and this pan-European campaign is going to achieve? Do you want people to stop drinking orange juice?
No, I think that's not the message we want to give to the audience, to the consumers. What is important for us is that consumers, retailers, and other importers of this orange juice, they deal with the exporters in Brazil and other countries that are exporting orange juice in order that they can improve the working conditions, the respect to the environment because of the use of pesticides. So with pressure from abroad, I think the companies in Brazil can improve the situation of the workers and the environment in the orange plantations.
But either they will lose sales if people start looking at the origin of their orange juice, or they're going to end up putting up their prices because they're going to say we can't any longer produce it at the price we're selling it at.
Yeah, but in Brazil you have other examples about this. For example, Brazil is one of the most important exporters of beef. And we had this kind of problem in the beef sector years ago. And we started a campaign, an international campaign, and now we have stronger laws, and also companies that are importing the beef from Brazil put more pressures on the exporters in the country, and the working conditions improved a lot in the past years.
So you want the support of Europeans, and I think there's an online petition as well if people look for supply change, but it's CHA !NGE, and that presumably will take them to the website where they can sign the petition?
Yes. And our partners here in Europe will talk to the companies, the importers, the retailers in order to get support for the campaign.
This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
EU foreign policy and humanitarian aid, developments in the Middle East, was the title of a conference held last week in Nicosia. One of the keynote speakers talked about the impact of ISIS on the Middle East and Turkey politics. He is Zenonas Charas, and he joins us now. What really is, would you say, the impact of the ongoing situation in the Middle East, particularly with Daesh or ISIS?
Mm-hmm. I would say that, as I said at the conference, Daesh has had a great impact in terms of exacerbating the violence and therefore exacerbating the great gap or growing the great gap that there is between different regional and international interests. Because of that, the result is that different actors that want to ensure their interests take more proactive and decisive actions, which of course leads to more tension and more escalation to the conflict in Iraq and Syria, particularly Syria.
The role, though, of the European Union, and it became pretty clear that, certainly questions after the conference, that EU foreign policy is actually it's a misnomer, isn't it? There isn't an EU foreign policy because each country has its own foreign policy. So what role can the EU play in the Middle East? And I'm not talking now so much about the humanitarian result of what's happening. I'm talking about political solutions.
Well, 2 decades or so after the tragedies in the Balkans, which highlighted the inability of the EU to have a common foreign policy, an effective foreign policy, we see that the problem is still the same. Nothing really changed. And I think the fundamental issue is that there is so many different interests. So you have 28 states having 28 different kind of interests, and therefore the creation or the development of a common foreign policy that will have some sort of an effect in the Middle East to deal with the conflict or bring about development, economic stability, security, and so on, it's almost impossible. So unless some developments happen on the front of political integration, whether one thinks that this is right or wrong, the EU cannot have a solid foreign policy, a specific foreign policy that will have some specific results and hopefully also positive results.
And the other thing, of course, is this question of who is hitting who and where, and particularly when it comes to oil fields, for example. You did mention in the conference that they change hands fairly regularly, but one does also get the feeling that there isn't the political will, if you like, to possibly destroy what might be a very useful facility for Western nations if and when there is a result and a peaceful end to the conflict. So how much is expediency really driving what we're told is a military intervention?
I think to a great extent. So apart from Iraq, which was very specific, that it does not want its oil refineries to be hit, in Syria, where sovereignty is much more disputed, we have great powers, as you mentioned, not be willing to proceed to any sort of decisive hits on the main source of money for ISIS. So if Libya, for example, is any sort of indication, then we can see how after these sort of conflicts or civil wars, greater powers step in and try through their corporations to gain control or influence over certain facilities or energy production or exploitation, exportation, and so on. So this may be the case in Syria as well. Some people may be waiting for the war to be over in one way or the other. I don't think this matters, for them to step in and gain economically from the situation.
That tells us quite a lot about the state of politics in the West, and that too was covered during the conference, and whether or not one could say that pretty well it's dirty.
I think the politics, whether Western or Eastern, are always dirty. This is the nature of politics and international politics more specifically. There's no morality or ethics in how international politics is conducted. So I don't think that anything has really changed, to be honest. The problem with that is that nothing will change in the future, and the big question is where this will lead.
That is a big question indeed, and that is Zenonas Charas, who was speaking at the conference last week on EU foreign policy and humanitarian aid developments in the Middle East. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.